From the library of the New York Stock Exchange at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York City, you're inside the Ice House, our podcast from Intercontinental Exchange on markets, leadership, and vision in global business. The dream drivers that have made the NYSE an indispensable institution of global growth for over 225 years. Each week, we feature stories of those who hatch plans, create jobs, and harness the engine of capitalism. Right here, right now at the NYSE and at ICE's exchanges and clearinghouses around the world. And now welcome inside the Ice House. Here's your host, Josh King of Intercontinental Exchange.
Recently, we welcomed Getty Images to the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol GETY as one of the newest members of our community of 2,400 listed companies. But Getty Images isn't like a lot of companies that you might see listed here. Their assets are 477 million images, film, and video going back decades, refreshed every year through their Pulitzer Prize-winning photographers who cover about 160,000 news, sports, and entertainment events. The content, if you want to use that word, that fills TV shows, documentaries, magazines, newspapers, blogs, Substack posts, and so much corporate content that it's really impossible to fathom. A photographer takes aim at a subject in public, shoots, and instantly, it's what's known as intellectual property, an image that can be copyrighted, cataloged, and sold. In the case of Getty Images, through amazing technology that is subscription-based and mostly recurring revenue. And that got me to think about my own past. I was in the business of politics and government, setting up major national and global events for the President of the United States that were instantly fodder for the photographer with a camera and a lens. In the past presidential campaign, for example, that meant that anywhere Donald Trump or Democrats like Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg went, or anything they did, was open press or covered by a pool of photographers, instantly becoming a sellable piece of property, whether the moment was flattering or not for the candidate or office holder. At heart, it was and is a symbiotic relationship. The candidate wants to be covered, wants to be seen, preferably in the most flattering light. Magic hour, that time with the golden sun in the afternoon, always works best. On the flip side, photographers want images that move, that get sold and get used at the top folds of the New York Times. And that's when the cash register rings. And the truth is, maybe with the exception of Trump, neither the candidate nor the photojournalist really want to cop to the codependence of the process. As the midterm elections heat up, we're going to be talking about the relationship between candidates and the press and the people in the middle, the spokespeople, communications directors, and press secretaries who most directly facilitate that symbiotic relationship and aren't afraid to talk about it. And coming up on this episode, our conversation with Liz Smith, who's been in the hot seat in 20 campaigns for politicians like Barack Obama, Missouri's Senator Claire McCaskill, Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe, and the aforementioned Mr. Buttigieg. And now the author of Any Given Tuesday, a political love story, out now from Harper.
When you hear the word sustainability, you think, too big. When you feel you have to do something, you think, too complicated. Hold on. Think about your decisions. Get closer. Those that are big or small for you. Your decisions and other people's decisions. Those that have to be made every day. Step back a little. Think of the decisions that add up to many more. There are millions of decisions that change everything, little by little, for the better. Now think about who can help you make better decisions. And there we are. So that what you save, the planet saves too. To keep moving forward without leaving anyone behind. And now, when you hear the word sustainability, you think opportunities. At BBVA, we're putting new solutions at your fingertips in order to build a greener and more inclusive future. BBVA, creating opportunities.
You might not know Liz Smith, but you've seen her work. when a little-known former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, went from a corner of the Hoosier state to national political prominence in 2019 and 2020, with Pete Buttigieg eventually becoming our Secretary of Transportation, he had the expert media guidance of Liz Smith to thank. As I mentioned earlier, a veteran of 20 campaigns and now the author of Any Given Tuesday, a political love story out now from Harper. Pleased to welcome you, Liz, inside the Ice House.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
Your first trip to the New York Stock Exchange?
It's interesting. During COVID, when everything was shut down, I would run down here oftentimes and walk around. And it's a beautiful place to walk around, but I've never been inside before.
Beautiful building, our library, our place where we do all these podcasts. But during those COVID years, really, almost a ghost town outside.
It was. And that's why it was so cool to come down here, because you always think of it as a super bustling place. And now you see all the security and all the people around and tourists. But in the summer of 2020, spring of 2020, when everything was really shut down, it was sort of eerie to be down here. So it's great now to be here and see so much more life.
And congratulations so much on the book and the bestseller status. You must be, did you ever think you'd be authoring like this?
No, I've had a lot of ambitions in life, but I've always tried to be realistic in my ambitions. And I don't know, I never really pictured myself writing a book. But once I did, I wanted to do it right. And I'm really, really thrilled, heartened that it made the New York Times bestseller list. And when I got the news, I absolutely lost my mind.
I mean, think back about what I said as I was talking about in the introduction. What did they see through the lens when they framed Pete Buttigieg in it?
You and I both know that image making is pretty important in politics. And the image that we built for Pete was one that was authentic to who he was, but it made for good TV. It made for a good photo. You saw this 37-year-old mayor going around in shirt sleeves, blue tie, a uniform that made him instantly recognizable. And the image of Pete, the way that he looked, underscored the greater message, right? That he's a can-do guy. He is a mayor. He is someone who will roll up his sleeves, get to work for you, and will address issues in a different way from your typical Washington politician. And I did notice, the press really did sort of take a liking to Pete because he offered them an interesting visual. He also offered them interesting copy. He was someone who said interesting things that aren't necessarily the usual things you hear politicians say, and oftentimes not the usual things you hear Democratic politicians say. And it was helpful that he was, I think, a younger candidate because he did understand the importance of image and how he came across to people.
I didn't have these specific conversations with Bill Clinton, or if I did, I can't really remember him now, but he almost subconsciously knew that his visual framing was in some ways as compelling as the stories that he would tell. Did Mayor Buttigieg have a sense of being the model on the runway?
It is something that he had to learn. It's not something that necessarily comes naturally to the mayor of South Bend. And that was something we definitely had to talk about a lot in debate prep, is how do you look during a cutaway? Where do you hold your hands? How do you hold your face when you're listening to a question? How do you hold your face when your opponent is attacking you? And these are the things that any candidate really has to learn. But I would say that Pete did take pretty naturally to this sort of performance aspect of politics. And again, I understand that there are people who think, oh, well, the performance aspect of politics shouldn't matter. But, if you're giving people spinach, you got to package it with some ice cream.
So let's go back to the time of our lives when we couldn't wait to go get an ice cream with our parents. You must have been about 8 years old when you saw this movie where someone like me would be on the other side of the squawk box with James Carville and George Stephanopoulos. Let's take a listen.
There's a simple doctrine. Outside of a person's love, the most sacred thing that they can give is their labor. And somehow or another along the way, we tend to forget that. And labor is a very precious thing that you have. And any time that you can combine labor with love, you've made a merger.
Liz, you got to be relevant because we have a lot of mergers here at the New York Stock Exchange. But tell us about how the War Room hit an 8 or 9-year-old Liz Smith.
Oh my God. Just listening to that gives me goosebumps. I rewatched The War Room again recently because I was talking about it so much in my interviews. And it's interesting, I'm going on a tangent and I'll get back to it, but I had never met James Carville until right before my book came out. And then, of course, I'm citing it in all these interviews. And then he and I got connected. And, he is just a trip. He is just the ultimate character. But for me, watching that, it was like seeing this whole world of politics that I never knew existed, right? I'd only seen like the highly produced events that people like you put in front of my eyes, right? In TV, I never really understood what it was like behind the scenes. And all the labor, the love, the passion that goes into the work behind the scenes. And it's simultaneously the most unglamorous work, but the most glamorous work because it's so important, right? In politics, the work of electing a president couldn't be more higher stakes. And it was the first time I'd ever seen that curtain pulled back and to see what really goes into the making of a president and the passion, the dedication of all these people, but the beautiful aspects of it and maybe some of the more unsavory aspects, the hand-to-hand combat that both James Carville and George Stephanopoulos had to engage in. And it was truly just fascinating to me. And when I saw it, I think I was maybe 10 years old when it came out. I think it came out in 93.
93, yeah.
Yeah.
It was shot in 92, cut over Christmas, and came out in early 93.
And when I saw it, I was just like, wow, that is something I would love to do. And of course, not knowing anyone who'd ever worked in politics, but it was just such an inspiring film for me.
And I guess 7 years or so later, you'd begin to have that opportunity at Dartmouth College in the early 2000s. How did that experience, going to college in that state, New Hampshire, transform into this wild ride on the John Edwards for President campaign? Did it start with your parents, who were both lawyers?
Both of my parents were politically active, sort of on different sides of the aisle. My mom's stepfather was the longest serving town moderator in Franconia, New Hampshire. I think he was town moderator for like 28 years. One of my dad's cousins was Sam Ervin, and he was the head of the Watergate Committee. And so they both had, some politics in their blood and their family. And growing up would take me to political fundraisers, would host them at our house in Bronxville, New York. And, they just raised me on politics. And whereas a lot of people sort of didn't really have time for it, they taught me that it was a noble profession and something that I should pay attention to. And I was their child who really, really took to the world of politics. And one of the reasons, frankly, why I chose Dartmouth College over other colleges was because I knew it was first in the nation. And I knew that going there would give me an access to presidential politics that, going to some place like Princeton wouldn't. And really having that front row seat was incredible. I was, I think, 19 years old the first time I met a presidential candidate there. And I got to introduce people like John Edwards and I think other presidential candidates there. I was president of Young Democrats there. I started a student group for him there. And you get just this up close and personal view of presidential politics that you wouldn't get anywhere else. I ended up taking off time to travel the country for Edwards' 2004 campaign. And it was really, really cool. And how just special these early states are, and the access voters and college students. I mean, it's ridiculous. There's a whole thing in New Hampshire that voters there don't make up their minds until they've met a candidate four times.
4 times, yeah.
And now there's this whole push to change the early states, to get rid of Iowa, get rid of New Hampshire.
Bring Nevada up.
And I just think it's such a mistake. And I understand the concerns about diversity and the lack of diversity in the states. I understand the concerns about caucuses in general. But my God, from all the time I spent in Iowa and New Hampshire, those are states that take the responsibility of choosing president so seriously. These people, like make it their job to go see all these different candidates. And in 2020, it was a 20-person field. But like they take it really, really seriously, the role of vetting candidates. And after those 2 states, I just saw this massive drop off in the sort of seriousness of voters and how serious they took the role in vetting presidential candidates. And one of the things that I loved was not just watching, democracy unfold and not just being able to be a college student who could, at 19 years old, meet all these presidential candidates, but to see the growth of a presidential candidate like Pete Buttigieg that could only occur when you are in these living rooms getting grilled with sometimes the most arcane of questions and having to deal with voters up close and personal and not just like, the usual debate that you have on cable news. And that's a process that makes every candidate better.
When you were plying the country with Edwards in 2004, I mean, there were so many interesting parts of that campaign, both the primary period and also the general. But one of the major moments of one of those first in the nation contests was not in New Hampshire, but it was in Des Moines, Iowa. One of the major moments was this. Let's listen.
You had told us 1 year ago that we were going to come in third in Iowa. We would have given anything for that. And you know something? Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. And we're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Yeah!
What did that teach you about the media's obsession with gaffe coverage?
I actually open my book by talking about this because it was a really formative moment in my career. I wasn't working for Howard Dean.
It's, of course, the Dean Scream.
The Dean Scream. I got to know Howard Dean when he endorsed Pete for DNC chair in 2017, and I talked with him a little bit about it. And he's had very kind words to say about my book, which I appreciate because I was honest about that moment. But it taught me that, there are so many stories that you could have written coming out of that night. And that was a speech that Dean gave the night of the Iowa caucuses, that Kerry won. Edwards had just sort of come out of nowhere and come in a really close second place. And you would have thought that those would be the big stories, right? Kerry had been left for dead a few months prior, and everyone had sort of assumed that it was going to come down to Dean and Gephardt, and they had been polling at the top for a while. But all of the coverage in the ensuing days wasn't about, Kerry's come from behind victory and Edwards' surge. It was about Dean's speech and how poorly it came across on TV, that scream at the end, because it fed into this narrative that the media had of Dean, that he was unhinged or that he was a weirdo, that his supporters were weirdos, his campaign was weird. And it was completely unserious coverage. It had nothing to do with the race. It had nothing to do with policy. It was but it did show the importance of how candidates present themselves and how just one bad moment like that. And keep in mind, and I write about this in the book, and you understand this, I'd be curious for your perspective on this, is that for the press in the room, his speech did not seem weird at all. And the way that he delivered it did not seem weird at all, because it was a crowd of hundreds of labor guys, and we know how labor guys can get at events. They'd been waiting for hours. So he was trying to meet the energy of the crowd in the room. But because he was, using a unidirectional microphone, what was being piped back to, the cable news in New York and DC sounded very different. You didn't get all of the background noise. You got some of it. What was piped back then sounded completely unhinged, like, maybe Dean was losing it, but that wasn't reflective of the reality. And so you had this dynamic where you had reporters on the ground saying, hey, that wasn't actually what happened. But the cable news poobahs and in New York and DC saying, you know what? It's a better TV narrative if we go with this.
I mean, I deconstructed that thing in my own book. And I'll just tell a little aside now, because a very young Dean Advance man named Beau Willimon, who ended up becoming the creator and executive producer of Netflix's House of Cards and has become a very successful Hollywood writer, was assigned to that restaurant that night with Governor Dean. Maybe it wasn't him precisely, but a mistake was made. And the mistake was that one of the basic things when any performer goes to a venue is reverse monitors, that you have speakers on the stage that blow as much sound back to you as the crowd is getting, so that you can exist in this neutral bubble that if you speak, you hear yourself accentuate your words as loud as the room is going to be. But there were no monitors on that stage, so as you say, the crowd was boisterous, but Dean couldn't hear himself. And he was just trying to speak over the crowd so he could hear himself. You got to have the monitors back at you to neutralize that sound. And poor Dean didn't have it. He just couldn't hear himself.
Yeah, it would have been tough for Dean to come back after, coming in third in Iowa, no matter what.
Yeah.
But the coverage of him was unfair. It was unfair to him. It was also unfair, I think, to Kerry a bit. It was unfair to Edwards, because I think Edwards deserved more of a bump out of that. And it's unfair to voters and generally in the general public, because it portrayed something that
was insignificant.
Right, insignificant.
Yeah. I mean, talk about the journey from 2004 to a couple of years later. You got involved in the 2006 campaign between Claire McCaskill and Jim Talent in Missouri. And here's an ad that the actor Michael J. Fox shot for candidate McCaskill.
As you might know, I care deeply about stem cell research. In Missouri, you can elect Claire McCaskill, who shares my hope for cures. Unfortunately, Senator Jim Talent opposes expanding stem cell research. Senator Talent even wanted to criminalize the science that gives us a chance for hope. They say all politics is local, but it's not always the case. What you do in Missouri matters to millions of Americans. Americans like me.
So how did that ad trigger a political and media firestorm that eventually left you victorious, and what did it teach you?
Well, and that's one of those ads where if you just hear the audio of it, you don't get the full power of it. And it speaks to the power of images in politics. And I write in my book about how that ad came about. And when Michael J. Fox came to Missouri to campaign for Claire, I sort of drew the straw of staffing him. And I remember sitting in a small room with him. Oftentimes when you have these high-profile surrogates come to town for you, you just sort of post up in a hotel conference room and do this like rotating thing of media. And I remember like locking eyes with some of the media that came to interview him, and everyone, myself included, was just shocked at his physical state, because it had only been a few years earlier that he had gone public with his Parkinson's diagnosis, and he had largely been out of the public eye. But the symptoms of his Parkinson's were jarring. So when we filmed this ad, the words, I think, were pretty simple, pretty powerful, but what made them extremely powerful was the visual, because you see him, struggling to hold on his leg and, dealing with the tremors. And we knew that this ad was not your typical political ad. Oftentimes in campaigns, you just drop these ads and they're going to move voters. They hit the right sort of messages that they care about. But we knew that this ad was like a gut punch. And so we saved it for one of the nights of the World Series when the Cardinals were playing and when we knew it was going to be just a maximal audience. And it dropped, and it just like dropped like a nuclear bomb. Immediately, we just started raising, buckets of money, but immediately the national press picked it up and they were like, oh my God, wow, this is a really, really powerful ad. And the right wing freaked out. And our opponent, Jim Talent, the incumbent Republican senator, freaked out because one of the things he was banking on was that voters would sort of give him a pass because they viewed him as a decent guy, not overly partisan, a good guy, and who was making the right decisions for the people of Missouri. But this went at his core strength, because it's like, how could someone, a good, decent person, oppose the life-saving cures, stem cell research, which is a fairly bipartisan thing. And they just struggled with how to respond. And there were so many disastrous decisions that they made. They tried to bring in their own set of Hollywood actors to do a response ad. But even worse was it provoked this response from Rush Limbaugh a few days later on air, where Rush Limbaugh, it's obviously a radio show, but it's live streamed to the web. He accused Michael J. Fox of exaggerating the effects of Parkinson's and mimicked them on camera. And let's just say that did not go over well. When you think of Rush Limbaugh and his reputation, this is a guy who never apologized for anything. And it was a bridge too far for him. And because I remember right after he did it, it then amplified the ad a million times over. And I think we raised like $1 million within 24 hours of Limbaugh doing that. And the next day, Limbaugh had to walk back and apologize. It was one of the few times I've ever seen Rush Limbaugh ever apologize for anything. But it goes to show how an ad that is so simple and so stark, it didn't have like fancy graphics, but how just really simple visuals, a really simple message can really be the most powerful of all.
Let's consider the case of Terry McAuliffe. I've known Terry since the 1988 campaign, fundraising wunderkind who put Dick Gephardt on the map. Guy's got a ton of charisma. But what did the 2009 Shad planking event tell you about when too much really is too much?
For your listeners who might not be familiar with the Shad planking event, it is one of those annual political events that, every state sort of has in their politics. And in Virginia, it's this thing where they like grill up bony fish and people go and they give these sort of roasts of their opponents. Now, Democrats don't really attend it anymore because it was very Confederate flag heavy. And so I think rightfully so, the Democrats realized that the optics weren't great. And Terry McAuliffe actually was the first nominee for governor to not attend. But in 2009, when he was a candidate in a Democratic primary for governor, we thought that the way to show strength was to blanket the 10-mile drive, up this like rural road to Shad planking with 25,000 yard signs. In some people's heads on our campaign, it showed energy, and this shows that Terry McAuliffe is going to have the resources to compete against Republicans. But it was actually the opposite. It played into one of Terry's weaknesses, which is that he was seen as this big money guy. He was this like brazen, just shameless fundraiser. Yes, but someone who was sort of trying to buy the nomination. And it was just a little too much. It was a little too gaudy. And I remember I was in the car with Terry and his wife, Dorothy. And his wife, Dorothy, was always sort of a voice of common sense. His spouses often can be on these campaigns. And when we pulled up and got out of the car, she just sort of winced and was like, guys, was that really necessary? And even Terry, who is someone prone to enthusiasm and sort of doesn't mind that ostentatious side of him, realized it was too much, and that too much of a good thing can be too much, and that it didn't convey strength. It was gaudy and it was too much. And 4 years later, when he ran for governor again, he ran a completely different type of campaign, one that was not rooted in being showy and doing these, ostentatious shows of viz, as we call it, visibility in campaigns. And it was a much smarter tactic to take.
Before we get to the break, Liz, just a quick little diversion into social media. You write a lot about how Barack Obama used Twitter as a novelty against Mitt Romney in 2008, but began to master it in 2012. And, Trump, of course, took it to a new level in 2016. But what was the state of play when you first started working on it with Stephanie Cutter, and how you see it affecting now the outcome this year and in 2024?
So it was really different. In 2012, that was the first presidential election where social media was a factor. It was mostly Twitter, if we're going to be honest, that was a factor. And Twitter then was very different from Twitter now. But we understood that we could use it to really shape the news in the moment. And, as you know, from working on plenty of campaigns, presidential campaigns, traditionally, your opponent goes out, does an event, an hour or two later, you email out, fax out, whatever it is, a statement, and the reporters just sort of plug it into their story and file it. What we realized with Twitter was that we could sort of shape stories in real time. So, for instance, if Romney was holding an event in Ohio and was asked a question from a voter where the voter, said something about Barack Obama being a Muslim or something like that, and Mitt Romney didn't condemn the comment in the moment, we could zero in on that in social media, on Twitter, get reporters to jump all over it. And before the event's even finished, an event that might be on auto jobs or something like that, the nature of how reporters are covering the event is completely different, and their angle is completely different because now they're going to say, well, actually, the news out of this is that Mitt Romney didn't condemn this horrific comment made by one of his supporters like John McCain did 4 years earlier. So it taught us that we could really shape the media narrative as it was happening in a way that you hadn't been able to do in previous cycles.
When we come back with Liz Smith, author of Any Given Tuesday, a political love story, we turn the page, as it were, in her new book, going from those early lessons on campaigns to the big show at the highest levels with Mayor Pete and what 2020 may teach us about 2024. That's all coming up right after this.
Connecting to opportunity is just part of the hustle.
Opportunity is using data to create a competitive advantage.
It's raising capital to help companies change the world.
It's making complicated financial concepts seem simple.
Opportunity is making the dream of home ownership a reality.
Writing new rules and redefining the game.
And driving the world forward to a greener energy future.
Opportunity is setting a goal
and charting a course to get there.
Sometimes the only thing standing between you and opportunity is someone who can make the connection.
At ICE, we connect people to opportunity.
Back now with Liz Smith, author of Any Given Tuesday, a political love story. In the first half of the show, we were talking about cutting your teeth in American politics and runs for the Senate, for the governor's mansion, for the presidency of the United States, and about the curious, often contentious, but sometimes codependent relationship between candidates and those who cover them. And now we're going to get into the ultimate case study. Liz, it's June 2016. You write that you decided to swear off politics and intimate relationships while decompressing in Uganda, for all places. But both of those ideas sort of collided with a column you read by Frank Bruni in the New York Times entitled, with a question mark, "The First Gay President?" Bruni's writing, of course, about the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg. You asked yourself the rhetorical question in the book, how have I not heard of this guy? And so I'll ask you, how had you not heard of this guy?
I am a political junkie in the truest sense of the word. And one thing I pride myself on is not just paying attention to the personalities in Washington, the senators, the Congress members who are on cable news and get the lion's share of attention, but always looking to the states to sort of see who are the interesting up-and-coming talents that aren't necessarily on Meet the Press every Sunday. And I don't know, I guess I missed the Bruni column, but as soon as I started looking into Pete, I just realized, oh my God, this is someone different, someone special. And it was very, very bold of Frank Bruni to write about, I think, a then 34-year-old openly gay mayor of a town of 100,000 people, that to write a headline suggesting he could be president of the United States. But the more I got to know about Pete, just from research, even before I even talked to him, the more I saw, oh my God, this guy could be the real deal, like that, like once in a lifetime candidate that every political operative like you or me, dreams of meeting and probably never gets to meet.
You wrote that of your first phone call with him, he checking you out, maybe you checking him out a little bit. Quote, he asked thoughtful, granular questions about media strategy. Curious, what did he ask you and what did you tell him?
Well, he was realistic. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with him, but this is not your average political candidate. This is a guy who's a Rhodes Scholar, speaks 7 languages, is IQ off the charts. As a woman in politics, it's pretty important that you not get easily intimidated, but he was just next level intelligent. But he was very realistic about, the path ahead of him and this is about DNC chair, not even his presidential race. And was like, well, I'm the mayor of South Bend. Like, why would the national media cover me? And how do we get national media coverage? How do I get national media coverage in a way that doesn't cheapen me? Because when I was talking with him, it was December of 2016. He was just about to announce that he was running for DNC chair. And just to bring us all back to that time period, that was right after Trump had shocked everyone by winning the presidential election. And most smart prognosticators, myself included, we understood that Hillary Clinton had her flaws as a candidate, but thought that she would win. So there was this idea among a lot of Democrats that we had misplayed our hand against Trump and that our strategy was all wrong and that to beat Trump, we had to beat Trump. And, Eric Holder had that famous quote that like, when they go low, we kick them in the teeth. And what Pete wanted to be sure of was that if he was going to run for DNC chair, he knew that he would have to sort of play on the national stage, was that he did not want to go out and be someone that he wasn't. And he didn't want to go out and sort of play to the lowest common denominator and, adopt this hyperventilating tone where he had to call every Republican Donald Trump and every Trump supporter every name in the book and demonize everyone and yell and scream to get attention. And he wanted to make sure that he could be true to who he is, which is a thoughtful, cerebral guy, someone who has appeal across to both Democrats and Republicans, is not a hyperventilating guy, and frankly doesn't present as an overly partisan guy, but still play on the national stage. So he was curious, could that actually work? And did he have to pander? And if he had to pander, that wasn't something he was really interested in doing. So I thought it was really fascinating that he was self-aware enough to understand that he was not really what the media was gravitating toward at the moment, but that he had sort of the savvy and I don't know, what would you say, the self-possession to realize that like if he did pander, let's say if he had decided to pander, that it would come across as inauthentic and it would undercut a lot of the things that he stood for as a public figure and as a politician. So getting into that sort of granular conversation was really fascinating because oftentimes when I interview with politicians, they basically are just like, okay, well, how do I get in the New York Times? How do I get on MSNBC? It's not like going as many layers deep as Pete did with me and understanding the nature of news media coverage and also understanding the importance of maintaining authenticity in your personal brand.
So if you were teaching a course at NYU and it was all off the record, but we're not because we're talking about a podcast, and give us a little clinic on developing and getting an exclu, as you say in the book about Pete's announcing his candidacy. This is the New York Times. You have one shot with a sort of modest piece of news that this person is going to run for DNC chair, but it could be for president of the United States. Like, bring us behind the curtain of the operative Liz Smith, the people whose names she has in her iPhone, how it's done, and what is the quid pro quo?
Well, quid pro quo makes it sound a little more nefarious than it actually is. I mean, let's be real. This is the exclu I talk about in here is about Pete's announcement for DNC chair. there is, nothing that any media outlet covets more than getting an exclusive, getting something first, getting a scoop, and being able to beat their competitors. So one, that's important. Two, you got to make the story a little sexy for them, right? Which is that when Pete was running, he was running as an outsider, a dark horse candidate, but someone with a very different type of message from the other candidates who were running and a very different type of background. So we could then make it a more interesting story for them, which was that, Pete wasn't saying, everyone who voted for Donald Trump is racist, white supremacist, sexist, whatever, and just running on an anti-Trump platform. He was someone who said that the Democratic Party fundamentally need to reorient how it talked with voters, and especially voters in the middle of the country. And so that was a completely different message from what you were hearing from other Democrats running for DNC chair and other national Democrats as a whole. So that's an interesting message that is sort of newsy for them. And it's sort of newsy because it is a little bit critical of the Democratic Party. There were people who were interested in him running for DNC chair who were big names, people like David Axelrod. So we could also give David Axelrod a call. He'll give you a quote. So it's a combination of a few different things, right? It's the playing to the competitiveness, giving them, something that they will have alone, giving them an interesting message, something that's different from what all the other Democrats are saying, and then giving them some high profile people who can go on the record. Axelrod was one. I think maybe Dean was another person. Think about if you're giving someone a nice gift and what would make a nice gift that someone would be excited to get. And that's sort of how you approach an exclusive.
When you're giving that gift, Liz, are you putting it on a text or an email, or you got to talk to him in person? Do you got to give him a time limit to accept the gift or not before you're moving on?
We had a sort of hard date for when Pete was going to get in the race. And so we negotiated, okay, he's going to get in the race by January 4th. So we'd like to get it out, that morning. And they go to their editors and in the days in the lead up to it. And sometimes these things don't work out. They pass on it. So then you go to the next outlet and you essentially do the same pitch until you find a taker for it. But yeah, you give them a deadline, and sometimes it's over the phone, sometimes it's over email, but you try to make it as easy as possible for them to do and do a lot of the legwork for them so that it incentivizes them as much as possible to write about it.
So then there is this pretty long political diaspora that was the period between ultimately the failed run for DNC chair in 2016 and his announcement for his candidacy for president in 2019. But curiously and interestingly, during that period, Pete gets pretty darn good at stumping for candidates in red states where coastal Democrats don't often like to tread. What was his ability to connect?
There was this view of the Democratic Party after 2016 that we had sort of, gotten way too much into a party of like coastal elites, true or not. That was the perception. And it had hurt us in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, all these states Rust Belt states that Barack Obama had won in 2012. So having someone who could then go out and be an effective messenger in these places was seen as really important politically, and something that was lacking in the Democratic Party. And it played to Pete's natural strengths because he was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. South Bend, Indiana is a Democratic city, but it is not a Democratic city in the way that New York City is. It is much more culturally conservative. Like when you land at the South Bend airport, and, you get picked up to go into town or whatever, one of the first signs or billboards that you drive by is We Vote Pro-Life billboard. And so it's, more culturally conservative Democrats. It's traditionally a labor town. It's very Catholic. So he, just day to day was very accustomed to speaking to Republicans, yes, but a lot of Democrats who didn't fit the mold of what you traditionally think of as liberal Democrats. And I think that gave him a cultural fluency that helped him And when he would go up and address sometimes these crowds of 1,000 people, and these are Democrats who oftentimes feel overlooked by the National Party, like they don't matter, and that the National Party doesn't try to talk to them or try to understand them, they would go absolutely wild for him because they realize, one, this guy's one of us. He gets it. He understands how we talk here. But two, he doesn't look down on us, and he's giving us the time. And so it went over really, really well. And that was when we started to see, okay, that he could make a run for this, and this is sort of a niche for him. And not a lot of Democrats were doing that at that time. They were really just playing to the base of the base.
Talking about that experience of flying to South Bend and what you see when you come out of the airport entrance, as you're helping Buttigieg craft this campaign plan, this New York City girl, is spending a lot more time out in Indiana. You worked in South Dakota for Tom Daschle, Missouri for Claire McCaskill, Ohio for Ted Strickland. But how are you now, older than you were in a lot of those earlier campaigns, mellowing a bit as you spend more and more time away from the West Village?
I think having the background of working in these very red states or purple states, whatever you want to call them, was really, really helpful to me in politics because it taught me that there are many, many different ways to be a Democrat, right? And, working in other places like Kentucky, West Virginia, you really see that a West Virginia Democrat is a whole different beast from a New York Democrat. So that was really helpful in my background. But in the ensuing years, I had eventually gone back to work in New York politics. I'd worked for Bill de Blasio. I'd worked for Andrew Cuomo. And it is a very hard-edged type of politics, very brass knuckles. Because, a lot of the communications is happening in the pages of the New York Post and the Daily News and tabloids and New York TV. And so it's a very, very, very different style of flacking and of communications. But then going to work for Pete, it's like night and day. And I remember in 2018, I was consulting for Andrew Cuomo on his reelection campaign, also consulting for Pete as he's doing these red state things. And you could not imagine a bigger study in contrast. But what Pete did for me, and what working for Pete and being on his campaign and being in South Bend sort of reminded me is that politics doesn't have to just be about punching your opponents in the face. It doesn't have to just be this race to the bottom that you oftentimes can get in these big media markets like in New York. And, it doesn't need to be like that. And it sort of brought me back to why I'd gotten involved in politics in the first place, which is that it matters to people's lives, and that what should matter most is not whether you have some barn burner of a quote in the New York Post, but whether you're going out there and delivering a message that appeals to people, and whether you're appealing to people's, and I don't want to sound overly idealistic here, but doing what politicians should do, which is appealing to Americans' better angels and their decency. And Pete reminded me about all of the good things about politics that sometimes had gotten lost in the mix for me during my tenure in New York City and New York State politics.
So to people who Pete would reach out to besides yourself, they would say things like, you got no name recognition, you got no money, you got no shot. And yet, I think part of your practice is to go back to 2016 and become a student again, watching how Hillary Clinton did it, how Donald Trump did it. And then I think if you try to weigh the pros and cons of those two, you end up sort of a big compromise by going much farther back, John McCain 2000. What are the pros and cons of each approach, and how did you ultimately tailor it to who Pete was and is?
Right. So I talk about how I did look at the 2016 campaign. The Clinton campaign, Hillary Clinton's campaign, had run a campaign where they had kept the press very much at arm's length. And a lot of that was because for 2+ decades, she had been target of a lot of unfair media coverage. And I think that had caused her team to sort of put up a wall with the press, to be distrustful of them, not think that they're going to be honest brokers, give her a fair shake, and be overly tough on her in interviews. And there was a lot of truth to that. And I can understand why they had that. But they would then go stretches of 200 days at a time where she wouldn't do a press conference. So you shelter her from the press, but then that means that anytime she goes out, she does an interview, or anytime her campaign does something and maybe there's a gaffe, then that's the press just like, sinks their teeth into it and they just run with it because that's the only thing that they've been given. That's the only thing that they can run with. Trump, on the other hand, gave so much access to the media in that campaign. As president, his communication style changed a little bit and his access level changed a little bit. But in the 2016 campaign, there was this idea that Donald Trump's gaffes would sink him, right? And the fact that he's making himself so available to the media and saying so many things that politicians generally would be advised not to say, it seemed like every single day he said something that a smart political observer would say, okay, well, that's disqualifying. That's a campaign ender, put a fork in him, he's done. But because he flooded the zone so much, it's like no one narrative could ever sink in about him. And a lot of, how you win a presidential primary is just by getting attention and blocking out the sun for your opponents. And that meant all the coverage that he was getting meant that Marco Rubio wasn't getting coverage, Jeb Bush wasn't getting coverage. Other candidates that you would have expected to rise to the top weren't getting coverage. And that was enough for him to win the primary. And I think it just it helped him in the general election as well. I wouldn't advise people to do necessarily what Trump did of just, going out and saying provocative, offensive things, day after day after day. But I did learn from it. And I think what I say in the book is that, you either feed the beast or the beast feeds on you. And he fed the beast. And in Hillary Clinton's case, the beast fed on her because she was not giving content to the media, because she was not giving them storylines. She was not giving them fresh sound bites or news. They then could just define her on their terms, and no candidate should ever let themselves be in that position. And so we learned from Trump's tactics, I would say, and tried to adopt them and married them with what John McCain did in 2000 when he had the Straight Talk Express, which is, just when you talk to reporters from that cycle, they all their eyes light up because it was the first time in modern history that someone had done that, which is an all access on the record bus tour. And it was something that engendered a lot of goodwill for John McCain and the media, but allowed him to overcome, a big money deficit with George W. Bush and get his name out there and earn media.
So all of this work that you had done with Pete, starting with the run for DNC chair and now really all this time in South Bend thinking about what kind of style he's going to adopt, how you're going to work with the press, even creating this uniform of the rolled up white sleeves and the blue tie. It comes down to a moment where, sort of to pick up on that Frank Bruni column, the first gay president, and most people hadn't heard of him the way that you hadn't when you were in Uganda, but he shows up finally at a CNN town hall at South by Southwest in Austin. Let's just hear a quick clip.
I know that it's more traditional to maybe come from Congress, to have a background in Washington. But I would also argue that we would be well served if Washington started to look more like our best-run cities and towns rather than the other way around. Think about it. One thing you've never heard of is a city shutting down because they couldn't agree on a policy, right? It's literally unthinkable. We would never do it.
So let's set the scene for us. I mean, a lot of work on your part to score that gig and then to get him ready to stand on that stage.
CNN was about to take out a restraining order against me in the run up to that town hall and locking it in because I was just relentless with them. 2020 cycle was the first time that CNN had really used these town halls in the primary process. And they held an early one, I think, with Kamala Harris. They got, big ratings, and then they'd had a couple senators. And, I just saw it as one, it was an important innovation. I mean, you and I both know that town halls are around in politics and presidential politics, but never before had you had a town hall where you get an hour to yourself, prime time, to just basically go out and make your case. And for a lot of people, that could be scary. And I know that there are some candidates who didn't want to do the town halls because an hour of TV means that, like, you can't just get by on a 5 to 7 minutes of canned sound bites. You're going to have to actually answer some real questions. But I knew that the town hall format would really play to Pete's strength, because he's someone who, yes, he can be great on TV. He can do the sound bites and all that stuff. And anyone who's seen him on Fox News knows that, you know, that guy is really, really good at that sort of stuff. And the jousting. But he is someone who is at his best when he can really let his answers breathe and speak in paragraphs. And there's something that I saw that was really refreshing about his style, because he was thoughtful, intellectual, someone who framed arguments completely different from the way that other Democrats were. But he was also someone who looked completely different, right? And I talk about that in the book, and this is a big thing, was like, we knew when we locked in the CNN town hall that if you're Kamala Harris, whether you do well or not, you're going to be fine. You raised $1 gazillion the day you announced for president, and no matter how you do, your campaign's going to live another day. With Pete, we knew that we had to make the most out of this moment, and that this was like maybe the only time this moment was going to come along. And so we prepared for it in every sense of the word, you know, prepared and like sort of figured out, okay, let's figure out some really key messages that you need to try to hit. Let's try to figure out, is there a viral moment in here that we could have that will take off and, you know, people pick up, other news outlets will pick up, and that people will run wild with. But also, you know, style-wise, is there a way that you could stand out? And it drove some people nuts, but I was a big proponent of having a different sort of look for Pete, and a look that was frankly very natural and authentic to him as a young mayor, which was, you know, the white shirt sleeves with the blue tie. And when the town hall started, I remember getting some texts from, I'm not going to say their names, but some very big names in Democratic politics being like, you know, Liz, I don't understand what you're doing with this look. It makes him look younger, not older. And first of all, they'd never seen him in a suit jacket. It was not a pretty sight. That was before we got him more tailored suits. But they also didn't understand that being different, just because things have always been done one way doesn't mean that they need to be done going forward. And you know this from working presidential politics, is that whether you're on the Democratic side or Republican side, there's a very small c conservative bias, which is that people tend to do things, only the things that have worked in elections past, and they're very, very risk averse. And so like the amount of criticism I got for this. And I mean, I ultimately obviously got the last laugh because it became a very distinct look for Pete, and it was something that underscored his sort of message. So it was thinking through the message, thinking through different messages that he could deliver, thinking through, you know, the need to deliver sort of a viral moment, but also how he would look different. And we developed, it was a very small team at that time. I was his only communications staffer. We had a campaign manager, and then we had, I think, a digital staffer and a fundraiser. And I made sure that the digital team had the capability to clip video, get it online, and send out stuff to our supporters to get them to amplify it. Because we had one shot here, and we need to make the most out of it. And so we ran it like it was a debate war room. And this is like March of 2019, and none of the other campaigns that were doing these things approach it this way. But having run Barack Obama's war room, I literally brought like the sort of tactics I'd learned from there, updated for 2019, to this town hall. And you've never seen anything like it, because he hit the messages. He had a viral moment. He looked so different. His style was so refreshing. And behind the scenes, we did all this work to make sure that our supporters were seeing it, our donors were seeing it, the media was seeing it. He just took off like a rocket ship And no other candidate that cycle was able to do what he was able to do with a town hall. But it was like, I always describe the campaign as having two distinct phases, like BCAD. It's like BCNN and ACNN, and it's the day after the CNN town hall, we woke up to an entire different world.
$7 million raised in just a couple of days. People started voting with their wallets.
Yeah, it's so quaint to think about, but we had set a goal of raising $1 million for the quarter. And I think this is about, the CNN town hall was, I think, 3 weeks out from the fundraising deadline. Up till that point, we'd maybe raised, I think, $300,000. And we were thinking, oh my God, $1 million, that's going to be a stretch. But then within, I think, 40 hours of the town hall, we'd raised $1 million. And then within the next few weeks, we got to $7 million. And when we announced it, like the National Press Corps was shocked because no one was expecting that. There was this other dynamic there, which is the DNC had put in place a threshold for candidates to make the debate stage because everyone and their mother was running for president in 2020 on the Democratic side. There were over 20 candidates. I think there were 26 candidates. And they wanted to limit it to only 20 candidates who could be on the debate stage. So they said that to make the debate stage, candidates had to have at least 65,000 individual donors. And we thought there was no way we were going to meet that. Within 24 hours of the town hall, we got those 65,000 individual donors. And the people I knew in politics, people would run presidential campaigns. I remember calling me saying they'd never seen anything like this. They'd never seen anything like that before in politics. They couldn't believe it. And they had been encouraging of me for doing this, but like we're pretty shocked by it. But our campaign manager, Mike Schmuel, had an interesting way of describing it, which is that like with that one town hall, Pete warped political time. And it's like that one town hall, with that one town hall, he skipped 7 of the normal steps that you take when you're running for president. And that's just not something that happens every cycle. It was something incredible to be a part of, and something that goes to show that conventional wisdom be damned, you can really do incredible things. You can really shock the system if you have a candidate as talented as he is, if you have a scrappy team, and if you are willing to take risks and not just subscribe to the old way of doing things.
Taking risks. And as we wrap up our conversation, I want to sort of focus in on that for just a couple more minutes, which is one of the things that Pete Buttigieg gets very deserved credit for is the comfort in walking out of the green room of Fox News and onto the set with their anchors to take whatever they have to throw at him. It's not the kind of risk that a lot of people who are wearing the D card want to take. And I want to hear an exchange that he had with Fox News Sunday's former anchor, Chris Wallace.
There was widespread criticism after you went back to South Bend that you showed more head than heart there. And in a new Quinnipiac national poll of African Americans, it shows that you have 0% support, 0 in the black community. Your response?
So we're getting a very good response in the black community to the policy ideas I put forward. But what you saw there and what we're dealing with at home is this wall of mistrust between law enforcement and between black residents. It is a huge issue. It is not unique to South Bend, but we are working through the pain of that issue in South Bend right now.
What can Democrats and their handlers learn from Pete's comfort in the lion's den?
Elections are won by the persuadables, by the swing voters. And it's like, you know, in 2020, that's how Joe Biden was able to win places like Arizona, Georgia, you know, states that hadn't gone for Democrats in a very long time. It was not because he ran up the score with Democrats, it's because he, you know, converted a lot of Republicans. And the way that you're going to communicate with a lot of these people is not by going on MSNBC or not by, you know, going on left-leaning outlets. I talk with a lot of Senate candidates right now and congressional candidates who are running in red areas. I'm close with Tim Ryan, for instance, who's running in Ohio, and he's really smart. He's running one of the best campaigns of any of the Senate candidates out there. It's an uphill race. It's in Ohio, but he understands that to win, he needs to reach out to the Fox News audience. And he's got to go out and make the case for himself there, because that is going to reach the voters who will put him over the top, not MSNBC. So my general advice with Fox News is do it, be prepared. Don't go on to like pander to the Fox News hosts. Go on to talk about your values and share your message, and voters will reward you for showing them the respect of going on the outlet that they exclusively, tune into. For the Democratic Party as a whole, we can't expect to do better in purple states and red states, especially in a tough year like 2022, unless we go into the lion's den and try to pierce the right-wing bubble. Because if we're just talking to ourselves, there is no way we are going to win any of these tough races. And I really, really hope more Democrats learn from Pete's example. And Pete, his favorite outlet to go on, the interviews he has the most fun doing are on Fox News, because to him, it feels like the one time that he's actually ever challenged and isn't just asked leading questions. And he likes it because it lends itself to, it creates more chemistry for him, and it's a little more intellectually stimulating.
Let's look to 2024 and borrow a Trump phrase as it relates to candidates, which is central casting. Our last two matchups were among septuagenarians. It could be again. But what do you think the alchemy is of the man or woman who really can excite voters from the other side? Background, work experience, gender, age, life story, comfort talking with the other side, intellectual capacity. I think you could check all those boxes for Pete. Humor, maybe not so much. What's the perfect package?
So I don't think that there's like any one way to be a successful presidential candidate. What's important is to sort of, meet the moment that you're in. And I'm going to challenge you a little bit. Pete actually has a pretty dark, a little wicked sense of humor, and he does have fun. And he was one of the candidates in 2020 who looked like he was having fun on the campaign trail. He was out there jousting with the press and on the bus and going out there and, going on Barstool Sports, TMZ Live, doing things that a lot of candidates wouldn't do. And most candidates would kill their advisors if they were, setting them up for interviews about, Kansas City Chiefs and Kanye and Kim and all that stuff. But, Pete had a good sense of humor about it. But point taken, you can come across seriously. But we need to see what 2024, 2028 looks like. As you know, everything can change on a dime. And what matters in these elections is whether candidates can really meet the moment. And that's why Joe Biden was able to do well in 2020, because people were really looking for someone who was serious and someone that they had enough faith in and trust in to beat Donald Trump.
Everything can change on a dime, and in a couple of weeks, we'll see if they do change on that very dime. Liz Smith, thank you so much for coming inside the Ice House.
Yes, thank you for having me, Josh.
And that's our conversation for this week. Our guest was Liz Smith, author of Any Given Tuesday, a political love story, out now from Harper. If you like what you heard, please rate us on iTunes so other folks know where to find us. And if you've got a comment or a question you'd like one of our experts to tackle on a future show, email us at icehouse@theice.com or tweet at us at IceHousePodcast. Our show is produced by Pete Ash and Marina Stanley, with engineering production assistance from Ken Abel and Ian Wolfe. I'm Josh King, your host, signing off from the Library of the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Information contained in this podcast was obtained in part from publicly available sources and not independently verified. Neither ICE nor its affiliates make any representations or warranties, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information, and do not sponsor, approve, or endorse any of the content herein, all of which is presented solely for informational and educational purposes. Nothing herein constitutes an offer to sell, a solicitation of an offer to buy any security, or a recommendation of any security or trading practice. Some portions of the preceding conversation may have been edited for the purpose of length or clarity.